People say there's a way you can take an early exit. You can get off this train now. You don't have to wait. And I think if we just look at it as, is this causing more harm than good in my life? And being able to answer that honestly.
Mary Tilson is my guest today. Mary is the founder of Sun and Moon Sober Living. She's a yoga and meditation teacher, a holistic recovery coach, and a retreat leader. In this wide-ranging conversation, we cover all sorts of topics, like Mary's journey through substance use addiction to a path of sobriety, the importance of discipline and finding your community, how the ancient practices of yoga and meditation can help us in recovery, how to be honest with yourself about your habits, and much, much more. If you are struggling with any kind of habit or behavior, whether that is porn or alcohol or social media or anything else, and you want some tools and strategies to help you break free, Mary has got you covered. Before we dive into the content, if you enjoy these episodes and want to see more, please do consider hitting that follow or subscribe button or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does mean so much, and I will be eternally grateful for your support. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Lipkowitz, and with over 12 years of meditation experience as a mindfulness trainer and coach for high performers, I've become obsessed with helping people break free from compulsive, unhealthy behaviors and addictions and step into a life of true freedom so that they can finally become their best selves and cultivate deeper and lasting fulfillment. I've created Unhooked, the Breaking Porn Addiction podcast, to give you simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies to master your mind and optimize your life. This is Unhooked. All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Unhooked. I'm your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz, and I am excited to be joined today by Mary Tilson. Mary is the creator and founder of Sun and Moon Sober Living. And when I started researching Mary and looking into all of her stuff online, I just resonated so much with all of the stuff in there, from the neuroscience, the yoga, meditation. So I just knew that we had to have her on the podcast. So Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm honored to be here. And as I've said to you, I really resonate with your work and approach to recovery. So I'm excited for this conversation.
So why don't we just dive straight in first to what you're doing these days? And, for someone who's brand new to you, just give them a sense of what is Sun and Moon Sober Living all about.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a certified recovery coach and also a yoga and meditation teacher. So the intention with Sun and Moon Sober Living is to create an inclusive community where people are welcome who are sober and sober curious to really take a holistic approach to finding freedom from addiction or just any unwanted behavior or habits. I know that there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily connect with words like addiction, or they don't see themselves in that label, alcoholic or addict, for example. And I just want people to be able to explore, like, if there's any substance or behavior you're engaging in that you feel is causing more harm than good in your life, that you can start to explore some of the tools that will free you from that, and to be able to do that in really a supportive community. So we have a membership with online meetings, did the first retreat that we've had in the spring, which was incredible. Hopefully we'll be doing more of that, and also have a podcast.
And so I know, for many people, sober has kind of the connotation with alcohol. And I know in your own story, it was majorly around alcohol addiction. But I'm guessing that people come to your community from all different kinds of behaviors and addictions and habits that they're trying to break free from. Could you tell a little more just about who kind of comes to your community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, most of the people come in and it's alcohol related, but what we realize, to me, it's like the alcohol consumption, I should say, is sort of the symptom of the underlying, whatever is underlying that. So we really look at what it is underneath that. Like, Dr. Gabor Mate has this quote, which I love. It's asking, like, not why the addiction, but why the pain. And so what we're addressing is, why are we turning to alcohol despite the fact that it's causing some form of harm in our lives? And so for a lot of people, like, sometimes what comes up on our calls, it's about sugar or it's about their relationship to work or, a relationship with another person. There's so many different things that we can turn to. But at the end of the day, it's looking at, what's underlying that? What's the pain or discomfort that we're trying to escape? And how can we find a more effective solution in order to find relief and to find a state of inner peace and, to be with people who understand what it's like to be in that position.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I really resonated with your content when I was doing some research is that you do go to the root of things. And it's not just this, okay, how do we stop drinking and just kind of use willpower and stop the behavior, but looking at the root of craving and the root of desire and longing and thirst. And how do you kind of fill that void that's in there? And I know for you that kind of the Eastern traditions of yoga and meditation played a big role in your journey. And I'm just curious, what was it about those traditions that were so impactful for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's first of all, what you said, like that idea of like craving and longing, I think it's been really helpful for me to get to understand some of these ancient, philosophies and practices that this is not just a me thing with alcohol. This is part of the human condition. This dates back thousands of years. And so, in some ways, with exploring the philosophies of, yoga and Buddhism, there's a huge doorway to compassion in that because I'm like, this is not just me. But what was really helpful for me with yoga was I went to treatment for the first time in 2010, an addiction rehabilitation center. It was outpatient treatment. I wasn't ready to get sober at that time. It was very much, my parents enrolled me in that. And I definitely was recognizing that substances were causing a lot of trouble in my life, but I wasn't ready to get sober. But I always like to say that recovery starts before the day you get sober. And it was during that time that yoga was really brought into my life in a major way. My mom started taking me with her to the studio when I was in outpatient treatment and I wasn't in the program. So, like, in those in between moments. And I really gravitated towards the practice. And it allowed me to get into my body and to feel a sense of calm and connection in a time where I felt incredibly disconnected and afraid and dysregulated. And so I started to, yoga started to become a part of my life then. And even though, I wasn't ready to get sober at that time and I finished that treatment program and I pretty much went back to trying to moderate right after that, yoga was still it was doing some of the inner work and it was having an effect on me. It was developing discipline and, having that discipline and, those tools to help self-regulate and all of that. It was what allowed me to eventually get sober, even though it took some time. So, um, that was when yoga first came into my life, and then when I was ready to get sober, I poured myself 100% into the practice. It was no longer just something that I did, an hour on the mat. I actually after I did treatment the second time, I enrolled in my first yoga teacher training and kind of decided to dedicate my life to it.
Mm. There's so many little threads that I want to pull on. You mentioned the discipline aspect and the discipline of yoga, and I know you've said a lot. You've written a lot about discipline as a pathway to freedom. And in our society today, it's almost a controversial topic, which is strange. That like discipline would be controversial. Like, oh, discipline is good for you because I think there's so much of this. No, we just want to be free spirited and don't tell me how to live, and I want to follow my heart. And I'm just curious, tell me more about what discipline means to you.
Yeah, I love this topic so much because it's almost funny looking back. Like, I thought when I was in like the height of my addiction, I thought I was such a free spirit, like doing whatever I wanted. I'd go out and party. I would drink in the morning on the weekends. I was, doing cocaine. The truth is, I was a slave to my addiction. I was every craving and impulse. I was acting on it. I was not making conscious decisions during that time. And it wasn't until I developed self discipline through these daily practices, yoga being the first one, yoga and meditation, that I was able to actually reclaim my ability to choose and make conscious choices. Because I like to think of it as, you gain access to that sacred pause. It's that moment of choice in between the impulse and the craving and actually acting on it. And I think that anyone who's been gripped by addiction or even been in one of those habit loops that you can't seem to break free from, whether it's like mindless scrolling or eating cookies in the afternoon or whatever it is, it's like we know what it feels like to be in that painful loop and you just feel like you've been hijacked and something has taken over. But through having a disciplined daily practice. And it's not something, as you know, we can't just turn to mindfulness and meditation like in the height of the moment to put the fire out. It's when we have a daily practice, that's when we gain more access to that space in between the impulse and the action. And so that's how I feel like I found real freedom is by having these practices in my life. And it's no longer that illusion of freedom of, being a party girl that does whatever I want. And wakes up in the morning full of regret.
Yeah, I love that you brought in this phrase of being a slave to your addiction because I think it's it's a phrase and it's a way of wording that I felt so much for myself and my porn addiction is I was a slave to my lust and a slave to my desires. And it's just so revolutionary to break free from that and realize, that you can actually break free from these cravings. To someone who is on the outside looking in and maybe they're still dealing with a lot of compulsive behaviors or unwanted habits, where do they get started?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I think the best place to get started is just to remember that I think sometimes we can have this all or nothing mentality. Like, we have to just flip a switch one day and it's like everything has to be right. But there are these, if you just start to sprinkle in, small little habits and incorporating like a little bit more mindfulness into your life and doing that with the support of a community and with the support of a mentor, like that's the biggest thing is you don't have to do it alone. And as I said to you before we started recording, I think it's so brave the work that you're doing because you're speaking about a topic that can bring up a lot of shame and there's a lot of misunderstanding around. And just to remember that you're not the only one experiencing this. Like, that's
Mm,
why I'm so glad that we have podcasts like this. Like, when I came across your podcast, I'm like, this is so cool that you are having an entire podcast dedicated to this because there are so many people that are struggling with this and feeling alone in it. So, to just remember, you don't have to do this alone. You can
mm.
find the podcast or the website. I mean, a quick Google search will lead you to other people who are going through exactly what you're going through. And then, through that support, starting to bring in small daily practices. A lot of this stuff is really deep rooted, like these addictions, as we start to peel back the layers, a lot of it stems from stuff that has accumulated throughout our entire life. And, these behaviors, they change our brain chemistry, they really work on those reward pathways. It takes time. And so to just be compassionate with yourself and to allow yourself to make slow, gradual progress. And I'll just say it one more time, like you don't have to do it alone.
Yeah, you mentioned actually earlier kind of what attracted you to yoga was recognizing that these behaviors have been around for millennia, thousands of years. People have been dealing with craving and addiction. And it struck me, one of the core components of self-compassion is understanding common humanity and understanding, hey, I'm not alone. And for me, that's been so helpful, particularly around porn addiction, because you feel like you're the only one. You feel like a monster. And with any addiction, there's that sense of I'm broken and everyone else has got it figured out. And I'm just curious, like, what is the role of community for you? Because I know community is a big part of it as well. How does that play a role in your recovery?
Yeah, it's been really huge. And when I mentioned I went to treatment for the first time in 2010. I was a college student at that time, and I had no one in my life modeling to me what a college student sober looked like in a way that would be any way remotely desirable. And this was way before there were like Instagram accounts dedicated to sobriety or this whole genre of quit lit or podcasts. Like, I didn't have any of that. And so to me, sobriety and isolation were like went hand in hand. So that's what I thought. Cause I was in a treatment center and I was going to AA meetings at that time, but I still like, I wasn't connecting on a level of like, I see myself in this person. A lot of the people were significantly older than me, or they had, very different. I was always finding a way to like other myself from other people. And I will say, like, even 3 years later, when I went back to treatment and I was ready to get sober out of a place of pure desperation, I genuinely thought in my mind, well, this has gotten so bad, it's kind of worth just isolating a little bit. I'm just not going to have the same social life, but I'll learn to enjoy my own company and I'll hang out with my friends during the day, maybe, and maybe they'll still want to be friends with me. And it's so interesting because that actually led me to, this path, led me on this path to Southeast Asia and, to go traveling because I finished that treatment program the second time. I was living in Chicago working at an ad agency. And as soon as I finished treatment, I enrolled in my first 200-hour yoga teacher training, which was great because I found a sense of shared, community and over shared interests in that space. But once that ended, I'm still, a sober early 20s person living in Chicago, not really sure what I'm going to do with myself. And that was when I actually made the decision to go on what I thought was going to be a 3-month backpacking trip to Southeast Asia. And I really found my community there because I met a lot of people. And it was just that their lives weren't centered around drinking and drug use. And so that was like my first sense of real community. I mean, I had community in the recovery space, but where I really identified on a deep level with people, it was that shared interest in exploring life in a deeper way and engaging with life in a deeper way that wasn't revolved around substances. But I will say that after some time, and I was living in a yoga and meditation retreat center and like really pouring myself into the practice of yoga and, living in this conscious community, I started to have this like longing to connect with people on the level of like addiction recovery. Like that was like a missing piece. And I really believe that we need that. Like I think we need community who gets it on that level. Like, yes, it was wonderful to be in this shared space of people who are on a similar path. But I remember it was the Recovery 2.0 conference by Tommy Rosen, which he was like super revolutionary of bringing all this stuff online because this was like in 2014, I think that he was doing like a big online conference. I just remember tuning into this from Cambodia and it was like, these are my people, like I need to be in this kind of space and connect with people who also know alcohol and drug addiction. So I do think that, with community, it's important to find people who relate on that level.
Yeah, there's something so incredibly heartwarming about being around other people who understand addiction. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, you're my people. You understand this path, this journey, this struggle, all the ins and outs that sometimes it feels like the rest of the world doesn't really understand. And yet at the same time, in some ways, it feels like everyone's an addict, these days in our society. There's so
Oh, yeah.
many ways that people, reach out for escape and for numbing out. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the spectrum of addiction? What is addiction to you?
Yeah, I think that you make a really good point, like about our society today. And I think we're at a bit of a disadvantage because I think that our society is set up to really prey on our susceptibility to and our, the potential to become addicted. And it's how a lot of like our technology is designed and all of that. And so, there's a very simple definition that I've heard Dr. Judson Brewer give, which is that it's addiction is any substance or behavior we engage in despite adverse consequences. So if you think about that, that could apply to so many different things. Like anyone who's listening, I think, could think about something that has created some sort of adverse consequence, but we find ourselves engaging in it anyway. I think that in our society, I mean, people get addicted to work is a really big one that, we actually get praised for and celebrated for. Technology, I mean, how many times have all of us just found ourselves continuously scrolling or spending too much time online? And it's like, it's so funny. I was thinking about this because that new app Threads just came out. And I was thinking, and I'm all for new ways of connection, right? but it was a surprise release by Instagram. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how many people had no intention of spending this time this weekend on this app, but Meta decides we are going to unleash this new beast. And how many hours were just hijacked by this company? I mean, isn't that incredible? Like, so I think that we can find ourselves, and in some cases, it's not problematic, there's not adverse consequences and we're able to moderate. But yeah, I think that if you look at it that way, that could be, indulging in like sugary processed foods that have a harmful effect on our body and our mind. Could be the whole spectrum of things.
Yeah. Yeah, the Threads incident is an interesting one because you're so right. It was a surprise thing, and then all of a sudden, everyone's on it and everyone's talking about it. And to me, it feels a large part of that was FOMO. People were like, "Oh, I don't want to miss out on being the first in this trend and getting more followers, and I want to get in there quick," because it's like, well, there wasn't something lacking before where people were like, "Oh, I really want a way to communicate with people." I mean, maybe there was that, but chances are people are just like, "Oh, okay, let me get in there quick." And um,
Yeah.
it's interesting, this concept of negative or adverse consequences, because that's kind of the definition that I've been going over. But I think I made a tweak to it recently because and as you understand, any addiction has some benefit that it's bringing, right? There's some reason that we're engaging in it, whether it's as a coping mechanism for some pain that we're feeling. And so I think for me, a way that I've been looking at it is like the net consequences are negative, because there are some things that are kind of an addiction, but the benefits that they bring are outweighing the harms that they might be bringing. And to me, it's okay to have some of those. For example, caffeine. Like, I drink coffee every morning and there are some negative consequences, but it's a net positive in my life. And so it's an addiction that I'm kind of okay with, or maybe it's not an addiction. But I'm curious what you think about that. Eh, how do you balance that? Because everything has some positive and some negative.
Right. And I'm really glad that you make that point. And I just want to emphasize too, like, I don't want to minimize addiction. I think that sometimes it can be harmful when we like throw around stuff like, oh, everyone's an addict. And because really, obviously, when we're talking about real addiction, there are devastating life consequences. And I think that when we think about like a broader definition of addiction, it's like there's a complex mix of factors that contribute to it, right? And that can be biological, it can be psychological, social, environmental. And so, of course, with my definition, that was way oversimplified. But I think just to, again, like opening up that conversation for compassion so we can kind of relate to one another in that way. But, yeah, when it comes to finding that balance, it's funny that you mentioned coffee because I know both of us have spent time, like, in retreat centers and in your case, monasteries, right? And I had I had a experience where I started to feel so much shame about my coffee drinking because I remember, like, when I did a silent meditation retreat, or I was living at a retreat center at one time in Cambodia where there was no coffee allowed. And I was just like, "Oh, this is really bad, like, this is," and I started to be like, "You know what? I need to be able to have, like, a healthy balance here where this is not causing harm in my life." If I got to a point where I was drinking 10 cups of coffee a day, where when I was in active addiction, I was drinking absurd amounts of caffeine on top of using, like, cocaine and Adderall. But where I'm at now, like waking up and having a cup of coffee in the morning and really allowing it to be that morning ritual, which I really, cherish. And it's something that I've had in my life since I was a kid and that, my family shares. Is that causing a huge amount of harm in my life? No, absolutely not. There have been times when I was drinking coffee too late in the day and it affected my sleep. Okay. Like I noticed that and I can readjust, but it's all about having awareness around it. And I think, again, I think the biggest thing is being honest with ourselves. Like that to me is what recovery is all about. I wasn't being honest with myself. I was kind of telling myself every day that things were fine when I was in active addiction. It was like my body was giving me all these signs, it was affecting my relationships in certain ways. And I just wasn't able to get honest with myself. But I feel like now I have the tools to recognize if I am, you know, zoning out on like a Netflix binge or, like overindulging in caffeine or, you know, recently I was going through a period of major grief and I realized that like I was consuming sugar in a way that I never had before. And it's like I can be compassionate with myself and understand why and then adjust, and seek
Mm.
support if I need that.
Yeah, I love that it's really about awareness and the ability to course correct and have this fine tuning of, oh, okay, like a little too far this way, let's course correct and come back to center. And maybe you go too far the other way and you need to course correct again. There's a topic that I'm very curious to hear your take on, which is there are some behaviors or substances that we can quit completely and say, I'm just never going to touch it. And there are some where we are forced to have a relationship with it. For example, food. Um, and I'm just curious on, well, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about is even on these ones where we can quit, is there a case to be said for having a healthier, let's take alcohol, just make it very, clear for people listening. There's an argument to say it's better to be completely sober and just never touch it because it's overpowering. I can't control myself when I drink it. And there's another argument to say, I want to learn how to have a healthy relationship to it and not be so restrictive and so kind of, I can never touch it. I want to get to the place where I can have a glass of wine with my friends. On this topic, where do you fall and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is such a great topic. And it's definitely it can be very polarizing in the recovery
I
space
imagine.
too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So my take on it is if somebody is coming, you know, approaching this with a how can I moderate? I would ask yourself first, like the thing is this if you are in a place where you're seeking help for your drinking and seeking support and cutting back, it's usually because there's been a history of trying to make attempts to moderate your drinking and an inability to do so. It's usually because there's been some suffering that has come as a result of your drinking. And so, usually, people who have the ability to moderate and, I don't really like the term like drink responsibly, but people who have that ability to just like enjoy the single glass of wine, they're usually not the ones who are seeking out help to be able to do that. And I think it's worth recognizing that, alcohol, like I said before, like it really impacts our brain chemistry, it hijacks our reward pathways. And so I think that it is worth taking a period of abstinence in order to make that decision for yourself. And so when I first got into treatment, it was the very black and white narrative. It's either you're an alcoholic or you're a quote unquote normal drinker. And that was a really big barrier for me at first because I did not want to identify with that label. I could not possibly see a future of abstinence from all substances. To me, it was like, that's not a life worth living. And so that was a barrier for 3 more years where, I went back to trying really hard to moderate. And by the time that I was back in treatment, I actually saw the label of alcoholic as like, all right, I'm an alcoholic. I know this for sure. And it was a huge source of freedom for me because I just thought I can accept myself as an alcoholic and I can move forward with this black and white narrative of like, I can accept myself as an alcoholic, focus on a life of sobriety. This is not an option for me. And, see people as different who are able to, drink quote unquote normally. But I think now we're in a place where we have a much better understanding of addiction and how alcohol impacts people. And it actually occurs much more on a spectrum. And not everybody who suffers as a result of their drinking is going to meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder. And that doesn't mean that you should wait until things progress worse on that spectrum in order to reevaluate your relationship with alcohol. And I think what's been really amazing to witness, especially within the community that I have, like majority of people do not identify as having alcohol use disorder or as alcoholics. Some people come in after they've been in recovery and they're looking for tools in order to really support that choice. But majority of people fall in that gray area in between on the spectrum. And I think it's worth considering, what are the harmful effects of alcohol? I mean, we know now like alcohol contributes to anxiety, heightened risk of cancer, it disrupts our sleep. It has so many effects on like our body and our mind that there are so many reasons that you might just choose not to drink. So I think, yeah, I think it's important for people to remember that, even if you don't identify as an alcoholic or meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, if you're feeling like there's something there, there's something worth exploring, it's worth taking a period of sobriety just to see what changes happen in your life and really ask yourself, why are you wanting to have that one glass of wine? Like, what is that giving you? Because you mentioned there are these benefits of these behaviors that we engage in, but with alcohol, the beautiful thing is the benefit a lot of people are seeking is social connection. And a lot of times when you get sober, you realize, oh, wait a second, I'm connecting with people on a much deeper, richer way without alcohol. Sometimes they're looking for relief from their anxiety and then they take a break from alcohol and they realize, I hear this all the time, this was making my anxiety so much worse. Or they're using it to get to sleep at night and then they take a break and they realize that alcohol is incredibly harmful to your sleep quality. So, yeah, the beautiful thing is you don't have to make a decision for the rest of your life today. If you're someone who's in the gray area, you're in a very lucky position because it means that you have that possibility of just getting curious and taking a break and you're not, you haven't hit that point of desperation. So, yeah, I think it's just keeping an open mind and remembering that you don't need to be, hit a rock bottom or be in the worst case scenario in order to make a positive change in your life.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing in this concept that it's a spectrum and everyone is at a different place. And some people, meet this threshold where it's, okay, this is a serious thing and I really have to take this very seriously. It's better if I just never touch it. And for other people, it's getting curious about what are the ways that this is affecting my life and experimenting. I love this idea of try it out. So many, and this going back to porn as well, with both porn and alcohol, so many people don't know what it's like to be free from these substances for more than a few days. For porn, many men don't know what it's like to not have watched porn in the last 3 days, going back to when they were a child. It's the water that we swim in. And so to think of, you need to give your body a chance to experience what life is like when you're actually free from it. And it takes some period of abstaining from it to actually experience that. Because, 3 days away, a week away is not going to do it. You need to experience, what is it like a month without porn or alcohol? What is it like for a year without porn or alcohol? And it's a case by case basis. It really is that self awareness of, can I have a healthy relationship with it, or can I not? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and what's been really cool is there are these trends now like dry January or dry July, sober October. It seems like every month now has been like the sober community is like, it's another time to take a break from alcohol. But that's just it. You can just experiment. If you're not somebody, who actually has a debilitating addiction and you need to completely abstain, if you have the luxury of being able to take a break and seeing what that's like and doing it in a supportive community. I mean, I think that's what's really helpful. I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that with porn addiction too. But I think with alcohol, we need people who are going to be able to support us and also kind of reflect back. I remember like, I remember really well coming to my group therapy group when I was in treatment and just showing up one day and being like, you guys, I was thinking about it and like, this isn't gonna work for me. Like, this is just who I am. I'm the girl who like organizes the parties and, this is how my social life is designed. And someone just said to me, like, he was like, Mary, if you were really like that, like if that's really how you were, do you think you'd be in rehab right now? And just to kind of like reflect back our madness sometimes or just help us when the doubts come in and, when we feel like we can't do it or, like sometimes when you first give up alcohol, you're expecting your life is going to instantly get better. Like we go from this all or nothing. It's like, all right, where's all the benefits of sobriety people talk about? It's like, no, it takes time. Sometimes it's harder before it gets easier. And that's why, having people to do it with you is that the same, would you see, with what you see?
Definitely. Yeah. Sometimes it's harder before it gets easier, 100%, because you're taking away a primary coping mechanism that someone's had for their whole life. And it might be their primary, the number one coping mechanism that they have to deal with emotional discomfort. And then you take that away and they don't know what to do with it. And so, of course, it's going to be challenging and you're going to go through periods of doubt and all these kinds of things. So, yeah, it definitely is challenging in the beginning. And this is, one of the things that separates people who are successful at recovery from those who aren't is that long-term perspective of, okay, this is difficult right now, but it's in service of a higher good. It's in service of a greater future. And I'm going to experience the discomfort now so that I can experience deeper joy and contentment and happiness in the future. And this is something I wanted to ask you about because I know it's a big part of your teaching as well is the leaning into discomfort. And this probably comes back from our shared love of things like vipassana and mindfulness and sitting with your emotions. And I'm just curious, what does that mean to sit with discomfort?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say I love what you just said about, recognizing that you're taking away a primary coping mechanism. And I think that's the key difference between getting sober and being in recovery is that we're not just removing something, but it's like, what are we bringing in? And recognizing that was serving a purpose rather than just shaming yourself from the behavior, recognizing, oh, that behavior actually was serving me in some way. And how can I meet that same end goal with something different because it usually comes back to a very human need for connection, for relief from our pain, from whatever that might be. So I love that you just said that. But yeah, this idea of leaning into discomfort. So this has been so huge for me. And I think that, oftentimes, again, like going back to the way our society is designed, everything is geared towards comfort. And I remember when I was living at this retreat center in Cambodia, like it was super simple, rustic. We had no air conditioning, there were cold showers. It was like really natural. And the teacher there would talk a lot about this idea that like we live in a society now where you get hot, you turn on the air conditioning. You're hungry, Uber Eats can be there in literally like less than an hour. You're bored, turn on the TV, pick up your phone. Everything is designed so that there is no discomfort. And I think we get tricked into believing that that's helping us in some way. But actually, I think that we are minimizing our discomfort tolerance to such a degree that it makes it difficult to even follow through on our goals. If we're used to always being comfortable, it's hard to motivate ourselves to, get up and do the workout or whatever that might be. And it's definitely hard to sit with cravings. And so, for me, I didn't realize this at the time, but I had no tolerance for discomfort. I would feel super stressed and overwhelmed after work, and I would have like a double bottle of wine, or I'd go out for drinks with my friends. In the morning, I'd be super tired and groggy. I'd be wanting to find Adderall. I would sometimes take a cab over to my friend's house on the other side of the city to get some from her. It was just like I couldn't be with anything. I was always trying to reach for the substance or reach for the thing to take me out of that discomfort. And so now I actually see incredible value in leaning into healthy levels of discomfort. Obviously, I'm not talking about inflicting pain on myself, but just things like, having the discipline to show up on the yoga mat, to, you know, if you're in a plank pose, like really challenging yourself physically. It's like feeling that moment of physical discomfort when your muscles are starting to get fatigued and you want to, drop your knees down to support you, but recognizing again that you have the power to choose in that moment to stay. I love doing things like getting outside and hiking because it challenges me physically, but I recognize that I can actually just take this one step at a time And recently too, I've been really into cold exposure. Like I love ice baths. And I think that that's just for me, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it gives me another opportunity to learn to stay with discomfort and meet that part of myself that wants to just spring out and actually recognize that I have the tools and inner resources to drop into a deep, calm breath and just stay with that experience. And on the other side of that, it's incredible that you get this like just like working out, you get this big dopamine release and, incredible response in your body that elevates your mood. And so, yeah, I love this idea of, and I think it's important for all of us to think of that, changing our relationship to discomfort. So when we are in those moments where we meet ourselves on the yoga mat, when we're working out, when we're in an uncomfortable social situation and we just want to crawl into our shell, to actually be like, see this as an opportunity for growth and to lean into that discomfort.
How does, let's say someone's listening to this, and let's say they're struggling with social anxiety, and when they go to a social gathering or party, they shell up and, they feel super uncomfortable and self-conscious, and they tend to reach for alcohol or drugs to numb that experience or to kind of change the way that they feel. And it's scary for them to lean into that discomfort. What advice could you give that person?
Yeah, this is huge. And it's been a huge one for me because I think a lot of people in recovery can relate to this who are on a, reevaluating their relationship with alcohol, who maybe once used it as a social lubricant or to feel more comfortable in social situations. I actually didn't realize that I'm more introverted as a person. I recharge being on my own, and I actually need more alone time than social time because when I was a drinker, which started when I was 13 years old, I could be around people all the time. I was like a party animal. I was a party girl. I identified as that, so I think first it starts with acceptance and recognizing, it could be that that social situation is not for you. Like maybe you don't really come alive in a situation where you're surrounded by alcohol and you're in a dark bar and everybody else is sort of wasted. Or, so there's that piece. I think it's like, what's the environment you're in? When I'm in those environments, even now, I'm really confident in my sobriety, but I just, it's not my best self that shows up in a bar at 2 a.m. with a bunch of drunk people. And actually, it makes me feel bad about myself and it makes me feel disconnected from other people. So I think there's that piece. It's just getting to know yourself a little better and understanding, getting familiar with that social anxiety and getting curious about it. But also, there are specific things that you can do. The first thing being, give yourself permission to leave whenever you need to leave and let that be okay. If you start by just taking small steps into that situation, I recommend having at least one person there that either knows that you're not drinking, that is familiar with your situation, is going to be kind of there as your support person that you can either navigate that party with or you can go up to and, socialize with. But I think a big thing for a lot of people, and this was definitely my case, was feeling like I needed to stay and still be the person who's there, the last person at the party. And I need to be like super fun and on the dance floor and doing all those things that just didn't feel natural to me when I wasn't drinking. So, like, accepting where you're at in that moment. And also, when it comes to drinking, a big source of social anxiety is that people don't really know how to turn down a drink. So, if that's part of your social anxiety, what are you going to say? Rehearse that before you get there. Do you need to bring non alcoholic drinks if they're not going to have that? And when it comes to letting people know that you're not drinking, the reason that you want to practice that is because a lot of us start off by saying it in a really apologetic way. Like for me, that shriveling up, it was like, I would first avoid the question at all costs. But then when it did come up, I would either go down two paths. I would get really awkward and start mumbling, or I would go into this whole self deprecating spiel about, like, oh, no judgment on you. I was a total train wreck and you should have seen me. And like just oversharing. So it's like, if you can just get confident with your response, it's really about the energy that you bring when you turn down a drink. And usually, if you confidently just tell people, oh, I'm not drinking, I brought some kombucha, that's fine. That's enough.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's actually quite a few of the clients I work with in porn addiction. We also work on drinking because oftentimes drinking and getting drunk leads into acting out with porn. And, as you know well, there's just a lot of downside to just drinking alcohol. And so this topic comes up often in the beginning when we first kind of talk about maybe limiting drinking or trying out a month without drinking. And so often there's this fear of what will people think if I tell them I'm not drinking. And what's so interesting is I think it's 100% of the times that we've tried this with my clients is having the confidence to just say, "Oh, I'm not drinking." On the contrary to it being, like people saying, "Oh, who's this person?" It's actually inspiring for the other people because especially these days, so many people know that drinking is just not that healthy for them and not supportive of their happiness and long-term health. And so often when you have the courage to say, I'm not drinking this month or I'm not drinking, it actually inspires those around you to reevaluate their own relationship and say, wow, like I wish I could kind of have that strength to come to a bar and not drink and to reevaluate my own choices around it. And not only that, you don't even need to give like a reason. You can just say, oh, I'm not drinking. And nobody questions it. They're just like, okay. And
Yeah.
so it's so funny how simple it can be. And on the contrary to it being a negative thing, it can actually be an inspiring thing for other people.
100%. I love hearing that from people. I can't even tell you how many times, like, I've heard stories from people where it just inspires positive change. Like, we think that it's gonna be this whole thing, I think. And for me, it was like I was projecting all of my worst fears onto everyone around me. And the reality is, people were either, sometimes people were curious and they genuinely wanted to learn more. I heard people, sometimes people like kind of leaned in or came up to me later and shared that, there had been a lot of suffering in their family related to alcohol use and they found it really inspiring, or, that they've been considering a sober curious challenge. Like, I think sometimes we need to give people the benefit of the doubt and recognize, like you said, times are changing. People are a lot more aware now of the more harmful effects of alcohol. And usually in the very, very small percentage, and I mean like over 10 years, I can count on one hand the amount of people who have come at me by giving me a really hard time and being negative about it. It says a lot more about where they're at with their relationship with it. And I can see that now. The first time it happened to me, I'll admit I really shriveled up and it was very painful and difficult for me. But I can see from such a clear perspective now, like I can meet those people with compassion and recognize that anyone who has a healthy relationship with alcohol is not going to attack someone for their sobriety. Like it doesn't reflect a healthy relationship with it.
Yeah, it's so funny because one, you can just see how obvious that is true with alcohol. That if somebody's going to attack you, clearly it's triggering something within them that they feel uncomfortable and they don't like that you're, bringing that to light within themselves. What's interesting is there's a lot of parallels between that and porn addiction as well. As I can count also on one hand the number of times people have when I talk about, breaking free from porn or becoming porn free or porn as a potentially negative influence, some people have a negative response to that and have kind of attacked and gone on the offensive. And, and what's very clear to me now is these people have an unhealthy relationship with it. It's like it's triggering something within them that they don't like people talking about how there might be consequences to
Yes.
watching the kind of porn we're seeing on these modern day tube sites. And it's just, it's such a breath of fresh air to just realize like, hey, if somebody's attacking you for you choosing to live a healthier life, it says more about what's going on with them than what's going on with you.
Absolutely. And if we can bring that level of awareness, I mean, that just goes to why, some of these teachings with yoga and mindfulness practices are so beneficial. Because if in those moments we can actually stay grounded and stay in a place that is compassionate, both to ourselves and that other person. I mean, it's especially challenging, right? When you're in a difficult moment and someone is like confronting you at a party, which again, I just want to emphasize is not the majority of what happens. I would say this is like the 1% of responses, but if you have that level of awareness in those moments, that can be like a superpower because that can be a huge trigger to people. I mean, the reason that social situations are one of the most challenging things is that humans are wired for connection. That is going to be a huge vulnerability if somebody is making you feel like you are not welcome here if you don't drink. And so I think being super aware of that is really, really important. And it also goes back to why it's so important to be connected to people who understand and to have a sense of community with people who are supportive of your choices and are going to give that positive reinforcement too.
One thing that I'm curious about is in terms of leaning into discomfort. It's one thing, if you're struggling with alcohol and you're in a social situation where you can actually leave or something like that. But in these circumstances where you can't run away from this, you can't, walk away. For example, boredom. One of the big triggers for porn addiction is people feeling bored or people dealing with emotional discomfort. And so porn becomes an outlet for that of, okay, I want to distract myself. I want something pleasant. I want to numb out. I don't want to deal with this emotional discomfort. What are some ways of leaning into the emotional discomfort when you can't remove yourself from the situation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think about times when I was using alcohol to cope with my social anxiety in work situations, networking events for work. And I couldn't just be like, oh, I'm not going to go. Actually, I'm going to stay home because that's where all of our relationships were being built. And there was an expectation for me to be there. And boredom, it's like a similar thing. I mean, we're all going to experience periods of boredom. Like a lot of these things, we can't always necessarily just opt out. I think the important thing is to recognize if you're using alcohol or porn or food or anything else as a way to escape discomfort, it's, yeah, getting really familiar with like what is the reward that that is giving you in that moment and how can you get there without engaging with this substance or behavior that has proven to cause you harm. And if it's something where you actually do not feel like you're capable of interrupting that pattern, like the compulsion is so strong, it might be something where you actually need to have some sort of physical barrier. I'm sure with porn sites, there's a way that you can create some sort of block of not being able to access those sites. It might be that you need to temporarily take a break from your computer if that's possible. I'm just kind of applying some of the things that we do with alcohol. With alcohol, it might be that you need to add some sort of friction, like, and that might be physically removing it from your house. One of the things, the strategies I gave the example for work was that I had all these I worked in advertising, and anyone who's been in that industry knows it's a very, very strong drinking culture in the agency life. And one of the things that was actually pretty cool is I was in a position where I was doing a lot of the organizing of how we were meeting with the salespeople that we were working with. And we started to go rather than going and doing these 10-course wine and dine type of dinners, we would go and do like a spin class or a yoga class, or they would take their budget and they would be like, why don't we go shopping at Lululemon versus spending $200 on each of you for dinner that night. And so it was just being a little bit more creative and proactive in that situation in order to avoid that. Um, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's just, yeah, getting familiar with like, what are you using this for? What is the solution or the outcome that you're trying to get from this? And how can you take another pathway to get there?
Yeah, I guess really investigating like what's the outcome here that I'm expecting? Like, what do I think is going to happen? If I'm logging onto porn, is this really going to give me what I'm looking for?
Yeah, definitely. And I
Yeah.
think it's difficult to get honest with ourselves about that, especially when things are positively reinforced all the time, whether it's because you're seeing that that's how people connect on a social level, with alcohol, it's like we're reinforced our entire lives. We're seeing that's how what alcohol is what adults use to socialize. It's how we celebrate, it's how we mourn loss. With porn, it could be that, young boys grow up and all their friends are talking about it and it's a cool thing and it's super normal. And, we can tell ourselves all these different stories about it. But if we can get honest with ourselves about, you know, I don't like I don't like being a slave to this thing, I don't want to give hours of every day, engaging in this behavior. I don't like who I become when I'm super drunk in front of a bunch of people. I don't like how I feel the next day. Like when we can get really honest about how our behaviors are affecting us, and again, not shaming ourselves, but recognizing that those behaviors are making sense and serving us in some way, we can just start to create new pathways to getting whatever the desired outcome is. And I think it always comes back to compassion, It's like these things they're very human of us, We want to have social connection. We don't want to be bored. We want to feel that little, that sensation of pleasure, fear, feed that desire to get whatever we're getting out of the thing. If we can be honest about that, then we can recognize there are infinite other ways to get there. Like that's the beautiful thing about recovery.
I, that was one of the things that was so revolutionary for me about Buddhist philosophy was most of my life was so focused on filling every moment with a moment of pleasure, a pleasant sensation, something that felt good. And Buddhist philosophy kind of turned that on its head and said, it doesn't make sense to try to have every single moment be a moment of pleasure because there are these eight worldly winds, and sometimes you have pleasure, and sometimes you have pain, and sometimes you have gain, and sometimes you have loss. And this is just the way of the world. And a much better strategy for a deep contentment is to learn how to be at peace with the ups and the downs.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, a big theme that comes up, I find, with the sober community is like a lot of people who show up first, kind of investigating their relationship with alcohol, realize that they have a really hard time giving themselves permission to rest. Like, because that's a lot of what I teach are these practices that help you kind of slow down and, take time, whether that's for meditation or a restorative yoga practice or walking outside in nature. And that's an incredible battle because so much of our self worth is wrapped up in like productivity and filling every moment of time and boredom. And, we associate these like moments of stillness with laziness and lack of productivity. And we've been conditioned, in order to see it that way. I think a huge part of that is a product of our culture. And so there's a lot of deeper work there a lot of times. It's not just, oh, here's what you need to do in order to support your sobriety. It's more like, all right, let's take it back a step. Are you comfortable with incorporating moments of rest in your day? Does it make you question your self-worth if you say no, that you cannot finish that work project because it just isn't possible without working a 14-hour day and you actually need to do some other things that support your well-being. There's a lot of reorganization that people need to have in their life and also their mindset around things, and that's a huge part of the work too. I mean, do you see that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think the word that's coming to me is acceptance. Like
Yes.
compassion is part of it, but also accepting that we can't be perfect at everything. We can't get everything done. We have to kind of accept we have limited resources and we need to recuperate. And we have to accept that somebody might not like us and to not run away from that and constantly try to fix everything, but just to say, okay, somebody doesn't like me. I can live with that.
Yes, exactly. It's such a huge there's so much work around self-worth involved in recognizing that you're enough. And I think a lot of times, when we're talking about substance use in a social setting, for me, it was like, drinking and doing cocaine. I felt like I was like this more desirable version of myself. I could be confident. I could, stay out later. I could, show up and be at every single thing. It was like I wasn't just enough as I was. It wouldn't be enough if I had to, not go out one night or, not be the one dancing on top of the bar or whatever the thing is. I never felt like I was enough. And that's really so much of it stemmed from that was just this insecurity. And so again, it goes back to the thing like you remove the substance and at first it can be hard, I tell people really honestly, when I first got sober, I felt like I was walking through the world like an open wound. Like I had started, like I said, using substances really young. So it was really hard for me I was just getting to know myself in a whole different way without them. And so I think we need to give ourselves the time and and really focus on practices that allow us to feel enough as we are without needing to morph into some different version of ourselves.
What are the practices that support your recovery?
So I have a lot of different practices. I would say the biggest staple for me throughout this whole journey has been my yoga and meditation practice. I really love yoga because it touches on so many different layers. It's the physical, mental, emotional, energetic, spiritual. It has a whole philosophy behind it. And so that's really been like an anchor for me. I think for one, my yoga practice every day is a way to help, regulate my emotions, come back to a calm place. Of course, we also have tools. I mean, the nice thing about yoga is that it gives you the tools to both calm yourself down if that's what you need, but also, we have breathing practices and physical practices that actually help, give us that boost that I once was reaching for other things for. So it's an incredible tool for finding balance, but also I see that as my daily check-in. And when it comes to like slip ups and relapse, when I think about that in the past, like yoga is a great relapse prevention tool because it allows us to tune in way before we're at the breaking point, way before we're at the point where our mind has been hijacked. Now I'm getting feedback from my body. When I wake up and I feel that buzz of anxiety, like a subtle buzz under my skin, I am not going to just suppress that and wait till I'm feeling explosive at the end of the day, and I'm at that breaking point. That is a big indicator for me that I might need to make some adjustments to my day or I might need to do some different self care practices. So I think that for me, yoga and meditation, it's like this time on my mat to really check in with myself and come back to a place of balance. And then I've just continued to build on that. So for me, getting out in nature is every day is really, really important to me. And I love hiking, moving my body outside. As I mentioned, I've been really into cold exposure lately. I love breath work practices too. And community is everything. I'm someone who at some point along the way, when I was a little kid, I never wanted anyone to see me cry. I always wanted to figure it out by myself. I had this super tough exterior shell, and I know that isolation is a really, really dangerous space for me to be in. So, finding ways to connect with people, whether that is my recovery community, whether that is my yoga community. And, it's been really important to me lately. Like I've noticed that pattern come up again. As I mentioned, like through the process of grief. It's so interesting. Like I just saw all of that come back. I just wanted to hide and do it by myself and figure it out and then come out when I was ready. And it took so much in me. Like it's amazing. You think you've got it all worked out through recovery. You go through one thing, it's the substances. And then something else comes up, and all those patterns just immediately resurface. And fortunately, I have the tools now to recognize it, but the temptation was still there. It's like I want to isolate and retreat. And so for me, it's like working with coaches, therapists, being part of a community, not isolating myself is probably the most important thing.
Mm. Yeah, community. There's this parable from Buddhist philosophy. I remember that Ananda was like the Buddha's right hand man, and he had this insight one day, and he ran to the Buddha and he said, "Oh, I've just had this huge realization." He said, "Community, it must be a whole half of the spiritual life." And the Buddha said, "Not so, Ananda, not so. Community is all of the spiritual life." And I love just this concept that it really is a community. Our connection with others is what it's all about, because isolation is just so painful. I mean, loneliness and isolation are some of the most painful experiences when we feel disconnected, because we're such a tribal and social species. We need these connections. And when you're in isolation in your addiction and you feel like you're the only one, it's such a painful thing. And there's so many benefits to community, being able to be vulnerable, having accountability. I find for myself, even just having someone to, like, having a close friend to talk to about whatever I'm going through that's difficult, just being able to talk about it, it takes the weight off my shoulders.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, it's like shame just like that isolation is just fuel for shame. It just grows and grows. And on the opposite end of that, when we bring something and we share it with other people, it's like survive shame can't survive in that space, you know? And it's such a beautiful thing like and if anyone's listening and they've never had that experience, like I can't even tell you how much it will change your life. And the beautiful thing is it's not like we need to bring that out to the public. We can so easily through the online space, there are so many tiny pockets of people who have these very, you know, specific combinations of things that we're going through that we think there's no way anyone else in the world could be feeling this, but they are, you know? And the more that you can like reach out and just start by sharing with one person, like you said, whether it's a friend or, you know, someone you meet who you really connect with, it's just yeah, the weight that gets lifted from that is just so incredible.
Yeah. This is a topic that has literally come up on every single interview that I've done, like community and vulnerability and the amazing benefits of sharing your story and how shame can't survive when you share your story. And I have a feeling that I have a bet that I think it's going to come up on every single episode I
Yeah.
do because it's so universal, you know, being able to share your story and how much shame really can't survive
Yeah, I
when you
think it's
share
like a
your
Brené
story.
Brown quote or something. Somebody like this came up just yesterday on a meeting that we, you know, we were talking about this idea of shame and yeah, it's such a beautiful thing and you realize what a gift it is to be in those spaces where we can explore our shared humanity. I mean, that was really the thing that struck me so much. As I mentioned, I started my recovery journey in the rooms of AA, and it was way more anonymous. Like sobriety was way more anonymous at that time. It was a lot of people were recovering really, really quietly. And this wasn't even that long ago. I mean, it's 10 years ago. But it wasn't like now there's this huge movement towards it. But I just remember like what was really cool is you'd go into the rooms and you have people from literally all walks of life. Like there were people because it was downtown Chicago. So there were people stepping off the street. There were people who were college students. There were people that were coming out of their lunch break on their law firm. You know, there was me, like there was all these different people. And everyone is speaking the same thing in different ways. And it's affecting them in different ways. But at the end of the day, it's coming back to the same struggle. And we're all keeping these shameful secrets in our public lives. And at the same time, when we come together and share them, it's like we were all walking away with a little more self acceptance, a little more confidence in our ability to walk through the world. And yeah, it's not like it just dissipates immediately, but it's like we slowly chip away at it in those spaces.
Yeah, and every time you do it, every time you share a vulnerable experience, it gets easier. Like you feel less and less shame around it. I wanted to ask you about shame because, you know, as you were talking about admitting to yourself and kind of getting clear about your own patterns, and sometimes you have these moments of clarity where you say, "Wow, I'm really not proud of the way I've behaved in the past." And seeing yourself clearly can produce a lot of feeling. It can make you feel ashamed of things you've done. And I'm just curious for you how you balance what we might call healthy shame, you know, of regretting a past action versus toxic shame.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I like to look at it like differentiating between like feelings of guilt and feelings of shame. Like I recognize that there was really important moments of like I when I at the height of my addiction, I really hurt people. Like I did things that I needed to be accountable for. And you know, the reality was they were close friends, it was family and I hurt them. You know, and for me to say like what I did was bad is how I think of like feeling that guilt that actually can be a really important kind of catalyst for change versus saying I am bad, you know, and saying like I'm a terrible person. I am like messed up. I'm hopeless. I'm all these things. Like that to me is how I think of that like toxic shame because there's not really much you can do from there. Like if I'm a bad person, if I'm an immoral, defective person, it's very easy to be like, well, I might as well keep going on this reckless path because I'm hopeless. But if I have enough self awareness to wake up in the morning and actually feel the intensity of emotion that I was feeling and be like, "Oh, like, that is not who I am. I'm not the kind of friend that behaves that way and treats the people that they love that way." That to me can be really helpful insight. Like, that gave me really important information, and to me, like, those were the moments where I decided to make a change because I know that I'm actually not that's not who I am, you know? So, that's kind of how I like to differentiate.
What do you say to someone who doesn't have that confidence in themselves? For example, if somebody feels like they really are that bad person and they aren't able to say, well, that's not who I really am. I really am a good person. That they really feel at their core like they are broken. They really feel at their core like they are unworthy of love. What what can someone in those shoes do?
Well, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. You would not be seeking out resources. You would not be asking the question if there wasn't a part of you that actually had some desire for change and who did care and who was connected, to this reality that you actually are worthy of making change. People who actually are so cut off from that, they're never going to be listening to a podcast like this. They're not going to be reading the books. They're not going to be in the rooms. They're not going to be reaching out to a coach. And I think that it's understandable when you have this history. Like, I don't try to sugarcoat it for people. Like, you know, it's reality. When you've accumulated all of this evidence through your addiction, and you can sit there and say, yeah, but I did this. I hurt this person. This is how I was as a parent. I ended up in jail. I lost this job. I don't want to like try to sugarcoat that or act like none of that happened. But the reality is, you know, that's not who we are. That's our behavior, and if we can recognize that and take responsibility, which we can do at any moment of time, like, it's amazing to me people that, go through 30, 40 years in active addiction and then they make a change. I mean, you can change your life completely, and I think what's really helpful for those people is recognizing some of the underlying causes that contribute to addiction. So, if you feel that way, I would really take time to educate yourself about addiction and what some of the components are. Like I mentioned earlier, like it's incredibly complex, and for a lot of people it starts with some form of trauma or our conditioning. Sometimes there's a genetic component. It can be environmental. Like there are so many things that are potentially beyond your control that you might not even be aware of that have caused you to find yourself on this path. And the more that you can educate yourself and understand that better, I really think it opens up a doorway to compassion. And the more that you can surround yourself with people who you will get to know as some of the most incredible, brilliant, loving, kind, compassionate people. You would never ever call them broken. If you go in the rooms of recovery, the more that you can surround yourself with those people and see your story in those people, you can start to free yourself from this belief that you are hopeless and beyond repair. And that just goes back to why the community aspect is so important. But I think overall, like our society needs a better understanding of addiction. And I think we're getting there, but stigma and shame and secrecy has prevented us from getting there for so long. But I think especially over the last couple of years with, things like the pandemic and, mental health really suffering and people realizing that addiction rates are going up and up, I think there's more awareness and understanding of where these things are coming from and that it's actually not like it's not an individual issue. It's more of a collective experience.
Yeah, I have to think also that the pervasiveness of other forms of addiction or compulsive behaviors are making other people understand. For example, social media addiction or junk food addiction, video game addiction. It's like these things that quote unquote normal people are dealing with on a more and more regular basis is maybe spreading some understanding that, hey, we're all susceptible to these forces of craving and acting against our better intentions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, is there any opinion that you hold that is maybe unique or controversial in the world of recovery? Something that maybe you believe in that might not be mainstream?
I would say, I mean, I think what's been really interesting to me, I'll say, in observing this whole sober curious and sober movement, it's like on the one hand, it's been really interesting to see how we've moved away from this black and white narrative of like it used to be, it was like there's the path for alcoholics and then normal people. And now there is a lot more conversation about, the gray area and sober curious. I mean, I don't necessarily think I hold a controversial opinion, but I think what's more important now than ever is really acknowledging that we're never going to find a one size fits all for everyone. And what I find potentially dangerous is when I hear people say, oh, that's the outdated model. That's the old way of doing recovery, and that doesn't work anymore. And this is the new way. And I don't believe in that either. I think it's really great that, we do have these new approaches and now people are recognizing addiction on more of a spectrum. But I also really want to honor that the traditional way, like 12 steps in AA, for example, it works for a lot of people. And rather than trying to squash that to the ground, and, my teacher, Nikki Myers, always says, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we're at a time now where, as more information comes available, we need to learn how to just continue to grow and evolve and adapt. And something that I've noticed, and I think this is just in our human nature, is like, we all wanna have the right way. We wanna know, like, that our way is the right way, and sometimes I see these conversations in the recovery community, and I'm like, "Why are we fighting against each other? We're all looking for to reach the same goal." And so I guess my hope with that is that we can just continue to, like, really, like, think of this as expanding the conversation and giving more pathways and recognizing that there's never gonna be a one size fits all for everyone. And so how can we approach people with compassion and with understanding and with deep listening and, find a way to meet on common ground? I guess that would be the biggest thing that I find myself thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, it's a great topic because there is so much divisiveness. And as you say, so many people, and we all are this way, we want to be right and we want to be doing it the right way. And there's this feeling like if somebody is doing it a way that's different from ours, it somehow invalidates our approach. Whereas it can just be that different strategies work for different people. There are some people where 12 step works and other people it doesn't work for them. And, there are other strategies that work for those people. And I think one of the things that I try to talk about is, find what works for you and explore. It's like experimenting, what works for you and what doesn't. Does quitting cold turkey work for you, or does trying to go down slowly work for you? Because those are different approaches, and it works for some people and not for others. So I
Yeah.
love that you have that approach of like, hey, let's be more open to that. There might be more than one way to get to the final destination.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing because I think back in my own experience, and what it brings up is fear a little bit. Like I remember when I first started to hear some people talking about this whole like sober curious thing, and like it did bring up a little fear because it disrupted everything that I knew, and that was scary because what I knew was keeping me sober. And so like I think that it does bring up a lot of fear for people sometimes, but I think we just need to, again, like, think about it as, first of all, make sure that what we're talking about is actually rooted in something. Like, is this rooted in science? Is there actually something to back this up? And just keep an open mind, and recognize that everybody is on their own unique path. And yeah. And when I do hear that, I think, yeah, I do. it does bring up some worry sometimes. I see this kind of AA bashing, and I feel like a responsibility to be a voice for that community. And it's not super common, but I do, especially now, like in the more modern recovery conversation, I find that to be really problematic too. And I think it comes back, like we were saying, it's like us wanting to have the right way. So I think it's just really important for people to remember, like, you can feel so passionate about your path to recovery and you can share that and get excited about it. And if it's really that powerful and good, you don't need to put anything else down in the process. That will be enough.
Why why do you think there is this kind of AA bashing going on?
So I know why it is. And a lot of it is rooted in totally understandable, legitimate concerns. So, for example, like a lot of the concerns that have been expressed, and for anyone who wants to go into this deeper, there's a great book called Trauma in the 12 Steps by Dr. Jamie Modich. She kind of lays it out really well about how we can adapt to be more trauma informed. But, I know some of the big barriers, for example, is there's gendered language. So, using like he pronouns and the words God and higher power, which again, like we can have an adaptive approach. For me, I didn't really resonate with God. I kind of associated with a religion, and that it just never was really something that I wanted to put my whole recovery on because I didn't have a really strong relationship with God of that form of God that I learned in the church. But fortunately, I was able to that was opened up to me as like I could find spiritual connection in nature. But that was me. Not everyone is gonna have that. Some people have religious trauma, they just don't want anything to do with that word. There's also the word powerlessness written in the 12 steps. Now, some people might see that as like spiritual surrender, which is how you might interpret it, like, surrendering that which is beyond our control. For other people who might have experienced, oppression or, various things, the word powerless is not helpful, and we have to be respectful of that too. And so, yeah, with that, I think that sometimes people see those things and it's a blanket statement that is wrong when really it could be this isn't the approach for everyone. And again, recognizing that because there are, some areas that need to be adapted, I think too it's an opportunity to grow and evolve that program. A lot of the text was written decades ago. It comes from a very different time and there was less education available then. But there's a lot of unbelievable principles. Like the 12 steps is a brilliant path and it mirrors a lot of the ancient teachings of yoga. Like there's an incredible alignment between the philosophy of yoga and the 12 steps. And so, yeah, I think that there is valid reasons why people might decide that that's not the path for them. And I'm not someone who's going to convince people. I like to be someone like I don't consider myself part of the AA fellowship now. I still really find so much value in the 12 steps and will forever be grateful. I'm someone who likes to open that doorway to people. Like I've had people who have come to me with who are very against it and would never step foot in a room and then became more open to it through conversation. But I don't think we need to convince anyone of anything. I think we need to the best thing that we can do is lay out the different pathways and see what resonates and what's going to be most helpful for people.
Yeah. Well, a beautiful answer.
It's kind of a long-winded one, sorry.
No, it's such a complex topic, and I think you did it a lot of justice because it's a sticky subject, right? It brings up a lot of triggers for people because there are a lot of people on both sides of the argument that feel very strongly. There's a lot of people in AA that feel very strongly about the approach, and a lot of people who it doesn't resonate with them who feel very strongly about some of the concerns you mentioned and some other concerns. Um, and and I just love your approach to it, which is, hey, this is helpful for some people. It's not the approach for everyone, and it's also okay to be in it for a while. And if you outgrow it and want to move on, that's okay as well. And it's really just find what works for you when it works for you, and when something doesn't, you know, you don't have to you don't have to stick in it longer than you need to, but you also don't have to bash it and throw it out and have a crusade against it. You can just have a more balanced approach.
Exactly. And that's shown up in other things too. It's funny, I find that same thing kind of showed up for me in the space of yoga, where I noticed that there was a similar conversation happening. I actually noticed this first in yoga and then in the recovery space, but it was like everybody's got the right way to practice. And you know what I mean? Some people have a more open approach to it, but there's a lot of there's different lineages, there's different approaches to the practice, there's different quote unquote right ways, you know? And I think we'll see this in all different areas of our life. So if we can just take that open minded approach for everything, you know, it's a huge service to ourselves and, of course, other people too.
And this is also what's great about, if for me in particular, what I love about science. My background is in the sciences and genetics, and I stayed away from everything spiritual for so long because I thought, oh, this is all just kind of fluffy nonsense. But we can actually study the effectiveness of things. We can do randomized controlled studies and say, does this approach work? Does mindfulness make you happier? Does it make you more anxious? So we can actually ask these questions and get results back. And of course, there's also your own lived experience. If a study says something doesn't work, but you genuinely feel it makes you happier, then that's true as well. Um, I'm curious, this is kind of a related question, but is there anything that you've changed your mind on about recovery since you started?
Yes, oh yeah, I definitely. So like I said, when I started treatment, I was very much in that kind of traditional recovery model. And I would say, you know, first of all, that black and white thinking. I no longer think that, for example, you need to be an alcoholic to stop drinking or that you need to hit a rock bottom. You know, I recently had a conversation with a woman, Carrie Wilkins, who specializes in supporting loved ones with addiction. And one of the biggest things that I think is so important for everyone to understand really is like, we used to have like, there's a lot of these kind of generalized statements about how to approach certain things. Again, it goes back to that whole concept of there's no one size fits all. And when it comes to how to address loved ones, so if you have like a sibling or a spouse or a child who's struggling with addiction, there are some really outdated ways of thinking that can be incredibly harmful. For example, you need to let them hit their rock bottom, otherwise you're enabling, things like that. I used to buy into that. I used to think because that's what the common narrative was. I don't know if you've heard that before, but there was this fear of like you need to like let them, let this run its course. And there was this fear that if you were providing them some sort of support, you were enabling the addiction because you were allowing them to keep going with that versus hitting their bottom so they could wake up. And I mean, it's not like I was like very passionate about that or found myself like defending that viewpoint, but it was only, more recently in really studying some of this stuff, I would say in the last like 5 or 6 years that I realized how incredibly harmful that is and have been trying to like engage people in these conversations because I think it's really important to address because addiction does not just affect the one person. It affects entire families and communities and it is like devastating for so many people. And I think that it's really important for people not to think that because there are actually things that we can do, and we need to be educated on that because every single one of us are going to be touched by addiction, whether it's our coworker, whether it's a child, spouse, family member, and so I think that's something that recently, like I really realized that we have had wrong for a long time and really needs a lot of conversation about.
It's fascinating because it's almost serving us a slice of humble pie because, you know, like you said, it's just the narrative that you lived under that, oh, yeah, and this is what I've heard in the addiction space, and you need to let people hit rock bottom and let it run its course. And there's so many examples of things that we learn through the narrative, through the traditions that we don't question just because we've heard it so many times, we just assume it to be true. And it's almost begs the question of what are the things that we are believing is true now that in 5 years' time we might realize is, oh, maybe that was actually harmful. And I'm curious, is there anything that you're starting to question? Maybe you haven't, gone from one side all the way to the other, but you're just like, Oh, this is an interesting narrative that might be more flexible than I thought.
Yeah. I love that you say that too, because I think it does humble us a lot, right? Like to recognize that what we're talking about, I mean, we need to be open to change and to learning new things. And yeah, I try to stay always open to that. The thing with addiction, which is so fascinating to me, and everyone has a different perspective on this, right? But I think we have so much information now about addiction. And at the same time, there is still so much unknown. Like we know that there are a lot of factors that contribute to why someone becomes addicted. And we know that there are so many tools that are effective that can help someone find freedom from addiction. And at the same time, if we actually had the answer, then we wouldn't have so many people struggling. Like the rates continue to rise, and what just amazes me, the more I've been in the recovery space, it's like you meet people who have all the resources in the world. They have a loving, supportive family. They have the financial resources to go to the best treatment centers in the world. X, Y, and Z cannot seem to get sober. You have the person who is addicted to heroin on the street who has absolutely no resources, no recovery capital, as it's called, and is able to recover. And that is something that I remain forever fascinated by. And that is where, and I know this could be potentially controversial, there's a spiritual component to that for me. Like that is, whatever is working there. And maybe one day we will find out and people will say that there was no spiritual component. This was the missing piece. But for now, like, I remain fascinated by that. There's an incredible mystery in that to me where I just it yeah, it leaves me very open to questioning and
Yeah. It's a great reflection. Just as you said, and there are people with all the resources in the world who can't break free from their addiction. And then there is someone in a dark corner somewhere who has no one and no resources, and they're able to pull themselves out like almost unimaginably against all odds. And it does beg the question, what is that secret sauce that that person has? And
yeah,
of course, there's differences in people's set points of drive and motivation and resilience. But it is something it's a very curious question to ask. Like, what is that secret sauce?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that we're continuing to find out the little things along the way. And there's definitely, I like what you said. It's like, well, there are certain conditions that we can have too in our lives that we can put in place that can help us, you know. And even if it is in that moment, like I love being in the rooms and hearing people's recovery stories. You hear about these moments of like people refer to it as divine intervention, and some people might not like that term, but it is that moment. It's like that. It's hard not to see that when you've been gripped by addiction as like this spiritual moment where something shifts. And I remember that moment for me, and it's like it's hard not to feel like there's something else at play because you pray for that moment for so long and you pray for that moment for the people that you love. And it's like, what is it that makes something finally shift? And I think that there is things that we need to, of course, be mindful of. Like it's like having discipline, having little things that are chipping away, that are kind of doing the work behind the scenes. There's a lot of that too. And but what those things are, what the specific recipe is, I'll be very excited for the day that we find that out and neither of us have jobs.
Yeah. It's, yeah, I mean, that'll put us out of work, fortunately, but probably it would be in a society that is much healthier. It's interesting because I was just on a call with a client just before this, and we were talking about that moment. My client called it the inflection point. And it's just like this for so many of us in recovery, there's a moment or maybe a couple moments where it's just like things shift, and what gives people access to that moment. For many people, it's a rock bottom experience of you hit rock bottom and you wake up and you're like, how have I sunk so far?
Mhm.
But, there are different kinds of inflection points. Some of them are these divine interventions. Some of them are experiences of a moment of peace that you never knew before. Like, oh, this is what I've been searching for.
Yes.
And yeah, it's a great somebody should do a PhD thesis on this topic. Like, what drives real recovery? Like, what are these inflection point moments that give people that secret sauce?
Yeah. It is amazing to think about. I mean, and I encourage people to do that, to just like, spend some time sitting with that. I think it can open your mind up a lot just to get curious. But I think too, like a big work of having conversations like this, through podcasting and exposing people to these conversations, it's like, for example, if somebody has been suffering from porn addiction for 20 years and had no idea that they weren't alone, that moment of intervention could simply be hearing that, oh, actually, there are a lot of other people, suffering from this too. And maybe that doesn't mean that they're ready right in that moment that they hear the first story. But again, it's starting to like soften, chip away at things in the background and kind of like loosen the knot a little bit.
Yeah. With porn addiction, it's a strange one because for so many people, they're not aware that they're suffering from porn addiction
Mm.
because it's so deeply ingrained in our society, and so many of the consequences are subtle and downstream. So it's not like a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction where you feel hungover the next day and oh, this is from that, bender that I had last night at the club. With porn addiction, and they're so subtle that so many people walk around not realizing what they're doing to their minds, what they're doing to their brains, to their relationships, to their happiness, because there's this kind of disconnect. Like, oh, that's just porn. Like, that has nothing to do with my performance in bed or my relationship with my wife. Um, so for a lot of people, that inflection moment is the moment they realize, oh my gosh, like porn is actually having an influence on me. For me, it was understanding neuroplasticity and how we're actually hardwiring these different neural pathways. And I was like, in that moment, that was an inflection point for me. It was realizing I am hardwiring suffering by every time I log on, and I'm hardwiring the neural pathways of craving and lust and desire. And that is what's leading me to this suffering. Um, but yeah, the inflection point comes in many different ways, that divine intervention.
That's such a powerful way to put it. Hardwiring suffering. So true. We don't think about that. We think we're giving ourselves some form of pleasure, and I think having that reframe is super, super important.
Yeah, but we get hooked on, and we need that pleasure more and more, and we get more and more conditioned to it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think these behaviors sometimes can be even more difficult, whether that's porn. For some people, I know that's cannabis. It's like you're not going to have necessarily this devastating rock bottom. And a friend of mine speaks about this a lot. And he's just like, it's like, it's these subtle chipping away at your satisfaction and your motivation. And, but you're never going to necessarily like hit the rock bottom. So, yeah, and porn, it sounds like, is the same way.
Yeah, I just had this insight, like, we need to come up with a new term for, like, a soft bottom, like, it's a slow descent. It doesn't there's no, like, jarring moment. It's just like this, oh, you're in the bottom. It wasn't a hard landing. It was a soft landing, but you're in the darkness and the depths, and we kind of need to make space for that experience as well, where it might not be a single moment where you wake up and it's like, "Oh, gosh, where am I?"
Yeah.
Because yeah, that's definitely true with cannabis, with some of these other ones where it's a slow descent into the bottom.
Yeah. I remember this friend, Jake Yoder, who I mentioned, he said it really it put it in perspective with him with cannabis when someone said to him, you're never going to hit a rock bottom. It's just trapdoors until you die. Like you're just going to slowly,
Wow.
and it's like you said, it's like that slow descent. And yeah, that felt really powerful because I think alcohol will be that way for a lot of people. You're not going to see like that bottle of wine that you have every night when you get home or the social drinking with friends. If you're just waiting for a rock bottom, that is just going to slowly chip away at your quality of life, maybe forever. Maybe you'll never hit it. But, people say there's a way you can take an early exit. You can get off this train now, you don't have to wait. And I think yeah, that's another way that the narrative is changing. And I think that if we just look at it as, is this causing more harm than good in my life? You know, and being able to answer that honestly, not in a way that's like, yeah, well, I mean, everyone else is doing it. It's normal. But like, no, if I'm honest with myself, is this habit serving me or is this causing more harm than good? I think that that's enough. We don't need to wait for our life to get any worse from it.
Yeah. And I think that this understanding of there's never going to be a rock bottom with some of these habits is so important to understand, because particularly with something that's very much related to porn addiction, which is social media addiction and endless scrolling, there's very few rock bottoms that you can hit with being addicted to social media, but you can waste your life away and it can hold you back from true happiness and deep fulfillment if you give your life to constant numbing out and scrolling. And so this idea of not waiting for rock bottom is more important than ever.
Right. 100%. Oh, we can give so much away. Comparison. I mean, it's like you can open up social media. You have literally no idea what you're exposing yourself to. And I'm not against it, obviously. I mean, I use it a lot to connect with people in the sober community. And it's one of those things you mentioned earlier. There are certain things that, we choose to have abstinence from. And there are other things that we decide to continue to engage with. Social media is something you could easily just cut out of your life completely. But, if you do decide to continue to engage with it, maybe it's because it's helping you with your business or, maintaining connections. We have to be very, very careful and again, discipline with these things and noticing how they're affecting us. Cause, if you're boundaryless with social media, you have no idea what you're exposing to when you open yourself up to it. You can wake up in a perfectly good mood, feeling confident, feeling ready to seize the day, and then you see something that really triggers you or sends you down a trap of comparison and puts you in this negative spiral. And it's like, you didn't even have to go there. Like, who just took control over your day like that? So, yeah.
Man, we could have a whole podcast on social media addiction and the ways that it's influencing us.
Yeah.
It's yeah, like you said, the comparison, the FOMO, the sense of like my life isn't as good as these other people, or just the numbing out and just the time wasting.
Hmm.
Not to mention what it's doing on a dopaminergic level, like on a neurological level, and screwing with our dopamine systems.
Oh my gosh.
And
Yeah.
we become so unable to take joy in simple pleasures because we're so used to this hyper stimulus. TikTok is just, it's so like every 3 seconds, it's perfectly fine tuned to give you the right drip of dopamine.
Right.
And then we try to like take pleasure in sitting and having a cup of tea on the porch. And it's like, this is so boring. Like, I can't sit with this. And so we pull out our phone and like, okay, dating apps, TikTok, Instagram, email.
So true. And again, like it's important for people to understand that these companies have employed the top psychiatrists and psychologists and neuroscientists to tap into that dopamine system and to fine tune it so perfectly that it will really like hijack you in those moments. And so, again, like coming back to a place of compassion. And if you find yourself in that place, recognizing that it has been designed to do that to us, and that's why and I think our world is just moving more in that direction. There is so much unfortunately, like, all this information we're talking about with, like, the neuroscience piece, it can be used for good or for potentially not so good causes, and so the more that we can educate ourselves and have our own practices and our own ways to have a balanced relationship with things, the better.
Yeah, it's a wild world that we're heading into. And another topic that I sometimes get into on the show is just what's going on with the younger generation and how much more difficult it is to be a teen and a preteen these days with all the social pressures and constant connection and the comparisonitis that's going on. And it's a wild world we're heading into. But all the more reason that we need to do exactly what you and I are doing, which is kind of normalizing these topics of addiction and craving and how to have a healthier relationship to some of these substances or behaviors that are so engrossing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I look at it I try to keep an optimistic view because on the one point, it is really terrifying when you think about it a lot, like, what the younger generation is up against. I mean, in so many different ways, even just substances now, like there's all these cases with like overdose from fentanyl, and it's just it's no longer, even like when people are using cannabis, like it's a whole different plant now that we're talking about. I mean, the level of THC and like it's just different than what generations were smoking or using before, and comes with a lot more risks. And so everything, I think they just need to have so much more awareness about. And at the same time, I think that they do. Like, I think there's a lot more conversation happening around mental health. I think there's a lot less stigma about, seeing therapists and expressing when you're going through something. So that definitely gives me hope. But I know there's a lot of work to do still.
Yeah. Do you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I would say, the most important thing to remember is just, and I know I've said this a lot, it's just that you're not alone in whatever it is that you're going through. And the more that we isolate, as we talked about, we can really convince ourselves that this is a me thing. This is something that's defective about me that I need to hide and protect from the world. And the reality is a lot of these behaviors, it's stemming from the same root cause, the same very human needs that we all have. And so to just don't try to go at this alone, and to find a community of people that you can walk this path with. And, whether that is alcohol and drug addiction, porn addiction, whether you are feeling really socially disconnected or depressed, could be a stigmatized mental illness. I've seen it play out in so many different scenarios, both with myself and people that I love, where we allow shame to really get the best of us in these moments. And you do not need to wait to be in a place of desperation where you feel like you need to be, forced into a treatment program or whatever it is. There are people out there and you can find them really easily, and you can reach out to one of us. You can, do a Google search, and you're worthy of the time that it takes to heal and to recover. I had a really hard time giving myself permission to go to treatment while I was working a job. I thought that was crazy and irresponsible, and I was throwing my life away at such a young age. But if you're going through something, you are worthy, and there's always enough time. It takes time to recover, it takes time to build these addictions, to carve out those neural pathways of suffering that you describe. And so just remember that you're worthy of healing, and yeah, that you don't have to do it alone.
Beautiful. Well, I guess the last question is if people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you? And maybe tell them a little bit about the community that you host, the weekly community.
Yeah, so I have the Sun and Moon Sober Living Community. It is a online platform. So we have a membership space where there's access to yoga and movement classes, breath work, things like EFT tapping, meditations, various different tools that you can access on demand, and some online trainings. And then we meet once a week at least on Sunday mornings over Zoom. And that's just a really nice opportunity to connect. We explore different themes every week that are kind of related to this conversation of a holistic view of recovery. And we have a WhatsApp group where we chat and connect. So there's a lot of different opportunities for connection through there. And I also have a podcast where I share conversations about recovery. And yeah, you can connect with me on social media too, share on there, use it mindfully as we talked about. Always a work in progress, right? But yeah, on Instagram, sunandmoon.soberliving.
Yeah. And, both you and I use Instagram and social media. And I'm a big believer that if you're going to use social media to be following supportive influences, like people like yourself that post inspiring and uplifting things that make you want to be a better person, and to unfollow the ones that make you feel like you're not good enough. So you are definitely one of those accounts that has a lot of inspirational stuff going on it. So
Oh, thank you. Well, same to you. I'm so glad to be connected.
yeah. Well, thanks for coming, and thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of the Unhooked podcast. That's it for today, and we will catch you on the next episode.